So it's good to see everybody. I haven't seen many of you in many years, actually. I haven't been to ITEXPO in a while, which I'm disappointed to say, but see a lot of partners, old partners, new partners, and some colleagues, so I appreciate you coming out. Thank you. I stand between you and the herding in front of the door to get into the ITEXPO show, so try to keep it short and sweet. As Bill said, just kidding, the topic today is going to be leveraging technology and business strategies to ensure you maintain control of your UCaaS business. So without further ado, let me ask a question, if you don't mind. Raise of hands, and I'm not sure I can see you because there's lots of lights in my eyes, but that being said, how many people, raise of hands, are already offering UCaaS services if you're an MSP to your customers? Got it? Okay, thanks. How many are not offering UCaaS services but would like to? Okay, great. So you might find this surprising, but I think I can address both parties in one presentation, but I'll let you be the judge of that. All right. So there's three ways that we find that you can offer UCaaS services to your customers. First is to be an agent. I conflated agent and referral into the same model, but slightly different. But for the purposes today, it doesn't really matter. Referral partners and agents receive commissions from carriers, typically. And that model is very pervasive. It's very well understood. It's not uncommon. We run into customers all the time that start out as an agent, and then they evolve up the food chain to the right. Second model is private labeling. And the third is buying and building your own platform. Your appetite for responsibility will dictate which model is best for you. So, for example, if you want to be an agent or you want to refer business to another provider, obviously there's a lot less responsibility around that model, that business model. If you would like to private label, you are taking on more responsibility. And if you want to build your own platform, you certainly take on a lot of responsibility. And those responsibilities can be pretty significant. Being a service provider, obviously, we have a big infrastructure to support our partners and your partners, our partners' customers. The majority of our organization is engineers, both software and network engineers and support. But those are the three models in a nutshell. The other thing you want to consider if you're going to, depending on the business model you're going to choose, is what's your financial goals. Amelia talked a little bit about setting your financial goals for 2023 based on that report, or based on Kaseya's report, which I think is very good, by the way. I've read it over the years. It's fantastic, really helpful. If you have revenue goals that are superior as it relates to UCaaS, you probably want to consider, private labeling or building your own platform. Not that being an agent is a bad thing, it's a great thing. But you get higher gross profit margins if you're going to move up the food chain, if you will, from left to right. And then finally, if you are going to take on more responsibility and move from left to right, then you have to have the infrastructure for level 1 support implementations. I often refer to it as IMACD. Implementations, moves as, changes, and deletes. So if those are not areas that you feel comfortable with, then agent might be a great model for you. This is a typical MSP service stack. So generically speaking, many of you are offering remote management and monitoring, storage and backup, security, access control, business continuity, and so forth. The reason that I have UCaaS in red isn't because that's the nature of the conversation. It's more because many MSPs consider UCaaS a little different in their service stack. They treat it a little bit like the redhead stepchild. And it really doesn't need to be that way. It's actually a very fundamental offering that many of you can be integrating into your service offering. Again, regardless of business model. 3 business models I mentioned earlier would allow you to become a service provider of UCaaS to your customers. The thing that you run into with UCaaS that most people don't understand, I don't think initially anyways, is that voice is just another data application. I mean, it used to be that you had to be the telephone company. You had to have POTS lines and PBXs and facilities and so forth, central offices. That's changed. Now all of you are actually very well suited to become your own service provider. The skills necessary to become a service provider of UCaaS to your customers are already inherent within your organizations. It's networking, understanding of networking, both LAN and WAN related, and typically whenever there's an issue with UCaaS, it's really within that realm, the LAN and the WAN areas. The other thing I'd like to point out about the stack is Kaseya has a great product. There's lots of other products out there that I know many of you are using, but it's interesting that I don't think many MSPs expose their customers to the service providers of many of the services in their service stack, yet they tend to do that if they're providing UCaaS, especially as an agent. I would argue that, to the next slide, regardless of your business model or who your service provider is, it should be you that provides the service to your customers. And we're going to talk more about this in a little bit. So there's two elements, as I say here in the slide, of a UCaaS offering that you can control regardless of your business model. And I keep coming back to the term business model, and I talk a little bit about, again, your service providers, but regardless of your your business model and your service provider, you have the ability to have more control over the implementations and installs and operations. Over the last 2 years, I've been involved with migrating approximately 30,000 endpoints to our platform from other options, let's say. We run into organizations who built their own platforms and become disenchanted with that. They recognize that the work involved in doing so and maintaining relevance is very difficult, so they want to turn that over to somebody like us to provide that service for them. Other organizations, they're unsatisfied with whatever service provider they're using, whatever business model they're using. Whatever the case may be, when you are migrating endpoints from one service provider to another, there's a lot of work involved, and if you plan ahead on your implementations and operations, speaking from experience, that doesn't have to be a very difficult, well, there's always going to be a lot of moving parts, but if you manage it well, it doesn't need to be a very difficult process. So the first area, implementations. What does implementations entail? It really entails two elements, phones and network. As far as phones are concerned, what we always recommend is that you use phones that are ubiquitous, phones that are transferable across multiple service providers, across multiple business models. You know, all the common names, I don't need to share them with you, but if you're using an off-branded SIP device and it's not necessarily going to be able to be used in another platform, you might run into some issues there. But you want to be able to use, in my opinion, also phone templates. So this is a little techie, and I apologize if it comes off that way, but the reality is that phones need to get their information from somewhere, and those phone templates that makes the phone operate should be under your control. You should have unfettered access to phone templates. You should be able to create your own phone templates. You should be able to modify your own phone templates. Those are things that should be within your control. Why? Because if you decide at some point in the future you want to change your business model, you want to change your service provider, being in control of those phone templates is critically important to you. Auto-provisioning is an element of phone templates. At the end of the day, you don't want to have to touch every phone either in the implementation process when you're doing your installs or after the fact if, in fact, you decide to change your business model or your service provider. So those two things sort of interrelated, but you know, as far as phone templates are concerned, you want to be able to point them to whatever direction you want them to go, and you want to have them be auto-provisioned so you don't have to touch every phone either in the implementation process or after the fact if you decide to change your business model down the road. You should also be able to remotely reboot your phones. Now, it sounds like probably an insignificant thing, but the reality is that if you are providing services to your customers and you don't want to have to deploy people on site, and you can push a button and have that phone reboot itself, it comes in handy in a lot of different ways. Again, during the implementation process, not typically, but during support calls and issues that you might encounter from your customers, or if you change your business model or you change the service provider, it becomes really helpful. The other thing we always recommend with our partners is that you want to provide the phones. There's a variety of ways that you can provide phones to your customers. We offer something called device as a service for what it's worth, but that's not the only way to offer phones to your customers. If you bake in the phone to the service, you can generate monthly recurring revenue from that, and you have more control over what's happening within your customers' environments. The second part, as I just alluded to earlier, for implementations is the network. So, again, sticking with the techie stuff, DHCP option 66 is a very pervasive way of making sure that you don't have to touch every phone during the implementation process. The router pulls the config files for the phones and puts them onto the phone for you. You don't have to go to every phone individually and touch it. So if you're not familiar with DHCP, we can help you with that, but I'm sure it's not rocket science. I'm sure you can figure it out. Managed switches. So there's managed PoE switches. We would recommend that you provide a managed switch so that, again, you can have eyes into the infrastructure that you're providing to your customer, and that you can remotely reboot those PoE switches or ports within a switch so that you don't have to deploy people on site. The other thing with the PoE switch is, and again, I'm sure this isn't revelational for some of you, make sure you're providing battery backup. You have brownouts that occurred throughout the year, and those will result in service calls. Or if you're using battery backup, it just flies through that, and you never have to worry about your customer contacting you for a problem. You want to provide a SIP-capable firewall because the SIP-capable firewalls avoid fraud, and they also make it possible for the voice experience to be very good. So you really want to focus on that. A little known fact that I'd throw at you is SIP calls are not encrypted. So if you have a customer who has a pretty crafty IT person somewhere in their organization and they want to Wireshark calls, it's not impossible to do that. So what I would recommend, if you're going to deploy your phones, you would want to make sure that you can do SIP encryption. And it comes in handy. I can tell you from experience a couple of situations. It doesn't happen a lot, but there are a couple of situations where it's come in handy for our service providers and their customers. Operations is the second area where you want to make sure that you have more control. So I was having a conversation with a partner yesterday. That partner was an agent for RingCentral. Great service. They had a good relationship, but it wasn't the business model that he wanted to follow. He had the wherewithal, however, to make sure that he was always providing level 1 support to his customers. So I'd highly recommend that regardless of the business model you choose and the service provider, that you always provide level 1 support for your customers. Have them contact you. It's very difficult for a customer to figure out what the problem is and then call somebody and try to have them troubleshoot that problem for them. You're the brains of the outfit. You're the organization that they're trusting for IT support. I would highly recommend you always provide level 1 support. Plus, if you, in fact, change your business model later and you move from, say, an example as an agent model to a private label, then, in fact, your customer is none the wiser. You're already providing level 1 support. It doesn't matter to them whether who your service provider is, and things just continue on as they were before. I mentioned earlier IMAC-D, implementations, moves as changes. That can be a little difficult for a MSP to manage if, in fact, they don't have the proper business model. You don't get access to some of those tools unless you're private labeling or you're building it for your customer. But I would highly recommend you take those responsibilities, if you can, on it, given the business model that you are under within your UCaaS solution. Pricing. No one's going to give it away for free, even though the slide shows that. However, the reality is that you should be dictating pricing to your customers. So if you have the advantage of reducing costs on the back end, your pricing to your customers remain the same. You also get to dictate what you're going to charge your customers. A lot of the organizations that we do business with have a service stack, MSP Service Stack, as I described earlier, and they have a blended margin across multiple areas. So they may put together a model whereby if you do this, 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 and this, I give you this for 50% off. So the more you have in your service stack, the more flexibility you have, and you have to be able to dictate is probably the wrong word, but at least provide the pricing that's most comfortable for you, and then, regardless of your business model, regardless of your service provider, that should be something within your control. Operations. So, I would always recommend, we always recommend to our partners that they always do network evaluations, again, regardless of the business model, so that, in fact, you can figure out, and I'm sure you guys are very adept at this, where the dead bodies are buried. All right? Is the network suitable for the services that you want your customer to purchase from you, that you want to provide to your customers, across all your service stack, not just UCaaS? So do a thorough network evaluation, work it into your sales process, work it into your evaluation, your qualification process up front with your customers. And again, that never changes as long as you, never changes regardless of the business model and the service provider you're using. Always provide a quote that you control with pricing that you control, and you want to have your customer paying you directly through an invoice that you generate and you're sending to the customer. As the slide alludes to, sell all the things that you have on your service stack. And then onboarding and training. I can't emphasize enough the value of you being able to go to your customer's location, if in fact you can do that. Sometimes you want to do a remote Zoom, but training your customer on the services, including UCaaS, of course, that you are providing to your customer, so they understand how to use the service that you're providing to them. Again, this should be, regardless of what your business model is and whoever your service provider is, you're controlling these three things. Platform. Let's talk about platform. So what is the platform? The platform is what's delivering the UCaaS services to your customers. That's the platform, the underlying software platform. Who are some of the common UCaaS platforms that are out there? Over the years, we've seen BroadSoft, you have Metaswitch, you have Bicom, NetSapiens, FreeSwitch, Asterisk. There's a lot of platforms that are out there that you have at your disposal, or that your service providers have at your disposal. If you want to build your own platform, obviously you can do the same. You want to understand what those who your service providers' platforms are, if they have multiple or if they have one, and you want to make sure that you're not just asking about features and benefits, which are important, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're understanding what the features of the service are, obviously. But we all know in technology, things leapfrog, right? They add, and it never ends. It's always going to be evolving, which is a good thing for both you and your customers. So at the end of the day, features are critically important, but often overlooked is what's the platform that's providing those features to you and your customers. And the ones I just mentioned are the most pervasive. I happen to be at an organization that built a platform based on Asterisk and bought a BroadSoft platform. Those were very wise decisions at the time. That was the technology that everybody was using, and it worked really, really well at the time. And then Asterisk became not so pervasive when it came to hosted PBX, which is what we called UCaaS in the old days. And so you had a situation where maybe Asterisk wasn't as suitable for a hosted solution, a cloud-based solution, as maybe FreeSwitch was. BroadSoft got bought by Cisco. So things change. Organizations change. Through M&A, you find yourself in situations where you have to always revisit your decisions, your partnerships. A lot of the partners that we talk to sometimes are looking for diversification. They're diversifying across multiple service providers, but they find out, or they don't find out, that all these service providers that they're using, typically two, are using the same underlying platform. So I'm not sure that's really diversification. They have to consider that. At the end of the day, you have a scenario where you may be diversifying across service providers. However, you're not diversifying because those service providers are using the same platform. So you have to take that into consideration. I started out by talking about the fact that we've been fortunate enough to move approximately 30,000 endpoints to our platform from other service providers, other solutions. And migrations, just a couple of quick words on migrations. So I could talk about migrations and the planning that's required in order to migrate customers for another hour. We don't have the time for it, but I'll mention a couple of quick things. One is you have to have a solid plan. You have to make sure that you know what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, who you're going to move first, if you're going to move your customers, what that's going to look like. And you're going to need assistance in doing that. We happen to have a migration team because it's something that we do commonly, but you're also going to have some of your best and brightest on that team to make sure that you can take responsibility for the migration of your customers. Second thing is, you want to send an announcement to your customers if you're going to migrate. And it's not, hey, we're moving from so-and-so to so-and-so. It's, we're upgrading. And because, again, we've done this many times, we happen to have a bunch of communications that we provide to our partners in this area. But as far as your customer's concerned, you're upgrading to a different service, and it's hopefully going to be a better service. It better be a better service, so you better not migrate your customers to that platform. You don't want any downtime. Plan for no downtime. Is that completely impossible? No. Is it challenging? Absolutely. But it can be done. We've seen it being done many, many times. And you don't want to go out and have to touch every phone. As I mentioned earlier, the reality is that if you do plan ahead on your implementation process and the technologies that you're using and the network infrastructure that you put in place, you shouldn't have to go out and touch every phone if, again, you change your business model and you change your service provider. It should be fairly simple for you to do that. So going back to the stack, I'll end on a positive note, picking up a little bit with what Amelia talked about. I was reading an article this morning that pointed out that 99.99% of all businesses in this country are small businesses. They're all ripe for the taking. They also pointed out that in 2021, 5.4 million applications were filed for new businesses, small businesses. That's a 50% increase from 2019. That's a big jump. What they're finding is that a lot of people who were checking out are actually starting their own businesses, which is exciting for everybody. Some of them may end up in the MSP space. But the reality is, small business are the bread and butter of this country, and they're all available to all of you to provide services to. So that's a very good development, obviously. You know, I would stay really, really close to your customers. Not that you don't already. I'm sure you do. If you're doing a good job, you're very close with your customers. But there's also going to be, I think, some turbulence in the UCaaS space in the next couple of years. A lot of the national providers have taken on a lot of debt for growth, which is a very sound decision. However, that debt is going to become due. It's coming due in the next couple of years. So I don't know what that means to these publicly traded companies that have funded their growth through debt, but there could be some turbulence there. If you stay close to your customers, I think there'll be a lot of opportunity. The good news is, even if you weren't the first service provider in the door, you can be the second. So I think there's a lot of, still green pasture, a lot of green pasture for new business, but also some for the taking from the national providers. Who takes care of your customers better than you? Did the national providers take care of your customers better than you? I would argue no, that's not the case. We have a bunch of white papers if you're interested. Feel free to email ITEXPO 2023 at whitelabelcom.com, excuse me. This is an example of the 4 white papers. The top one is maintaining control over UCaaS business. That's a result of the keynote address and some other seminars I've done over the last couple of months. So we're happy to send that to you. We also have a couple of other white papers you might find interesting. And we're at meeting room 5 if you'd like to come by. I can elaborate on anything that I may not have covered in enough detail for you. Happy to talk further. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.